August 21st, 1808. The hills above Vimeiro, Portugal. General João dos Juno had 13,000 men, massive artillery power, and the confidence of an unstoppable empire. Looking across the valley, he could see the British lines. He knew exactly how he was going to crush them. And that was the biggest, most catastrophic mistake of his life. Because what Juno saw through his spyglass wasn't the real British army. It was just bait. The main army had completely vanished. That day, Sir Arthur Wellesley executed one of the deadliest tactics in military history. When the French crested the hill, they wouldn't find empty ground. They would find a phantom army, springing from the earth, unleashing death from just 20 yards away. Welcome to Britain's history. Today we are covering the Battle of Vimeiro, the first major engagement of the Peninsular War. The battle that proved the French could be beaten in open combat, and the victory that very nearly destroyed the career of the man who won it. But before we get to those hillsides and the 4 separate French attacks that broke against them, we need to understand what brought a British army to Portugal in the summer of 1808, and why the French occupation of the Iberian Peninsula had given Britain the opportunity it had been waiting for. Napoleon's strategy for defeating Britain was economic rather than military. He could not invade. Trafalgar in 1805 had settled that question decisively. What he could do was close every European port to British trade, strangling the commercial engine that funded British resistance. This was the continental system, and it worked only if every European power cooperated. Portugal, Britain's oldest ally, refused. The Portuguese kept their ports open. Napoleon responded by sending Junot's army across Spain and into Portugal in late 1807. Lisbon fell. The Portuguese royal family fled to Brazil on British ships. Portugal became occupied territory. What Napoleon had not anticipated was that the Spanish would object, not merely to the occupation of Portugal, but to the increasingly obvious French intention to control Spain itself. In May 1808, Napoleon forced the Spanish royal family to abdicate and placed his brother Joseph on the throne. The Spanish rose in revolt almost immediately. Across the country, local juntas organised resistance. French columns found themselves ambushed, besieged, and on June 23rd, at Bailen, forced to surrender. An entire French army, 20,000 men, laying down their arms to a Spanish force. It was the first time a Napoleonic army had surrendered in the field, and it reverberated across Europe. Britain saw the opportunity clearly. Spain and Portugal offered something that had not existed since the early years of the war, a continental foothold, an allied population willing to fight, and French armies suddenly stretched thin across an enormous and hostile country. In June 1808, the British government authorised an expedition to Portugal. The man chosen to command it was Sir Arthur Wellesley, 39 years old, a veteran of the Indian campaigns that had made his reputation but had done so far from European eyes. He had never commanded a British army in a European battle. Vimeiro would be his audition. Wellesley landed at Mondego Bay on August 1st with 13,000 men and moved south toward Lisbon. On August 17th at Relica he fought his first action, pushing a French rearguard off a series of ridges in a competent if not decisive engagement. The French retreated in reasonable order. Relica confirmed that the British could fight in Portuguese terrain. It did not answer the larger question. Juno answered it for him. Learning that British reinforcements were arriving by sea at Porto Novo, and understanding that delay would only make his situation worse, he concentrated his available force and marched to destroy the British before they could consolidate. Wellesley positioned his army on the hills above the village of Vimeiro and waited. The terrain was everything. Vimeiro sits in a shallow valley cut by the Maceira River, surrounded by ridges that rise and fall in complex directions. Wellesley chose the western ridge as his primary position and placed his strongest brigades there. The village of Vimeiro itself, sitting on a knoll at the centre of his line, was garrisoned separately. To the east, the Ventosa Ridge offered a potential flanking approach, and Wellesley, reading the ground with the eye of a man who had been thinking about defensive positions since before breakfast, kept forces ready to shift there if needed. What made these positions lethal was not simply elevation, it was invisibility. Wellesley ordered his men behind the crest lines, not at the top where they could be seen, but just below the skyline on the reverse slope, where French artillery firing from the valley could not depress its barrels low enough to hit them. The infantry lay down and waited. Only the skirmishers, the green-jacketed riflemen of the 95th Rifles and the 60th, with their Baker rifles accurate at ranges that French muskets could not match, were forward in the scrub and brush, picking off French officers and scouts, and then withdrawing to pull the main assault forward. Junot arrived on the morning of August 21st, made a rapid and inadequate reconnaissance, and decided he could see enough. His plan was to hit the Vimeiro hill with his centre while sending a flanking column north to roll up the British left. It was not an unintelligent plan. What made it disastrous was the terrain he could not see, and the infantry he could not count. The first French assault went straight at the Vimeiro hill. Generals Thomieres and Charlot led their brigades up the slope in the deep attack columns that had crushed opposition all across Europe, formations that worked by mass and momentum, breaking enemy morale by sheer weight before contact was made. The riflemen fell back in front of them, trading shots and withdrawing, drawing the French up the hill. When the French reached the crest, they found the reverse slope waiting for them. Brigades under Fane and Anstruther rose from the ground at close range and delivered volleys that stopped the assault cold. From their flank, the 52nd Light Infantry swung out in an arc that caught the French column in enfilade. And then, the moment that would be remembered by every French soldier who survived it, the 97th Regiment, which had been lying completely hidden in a hollow behind the crest, stood up, delivered its volley at 100 yards, and charged with the bayonet. 7 French guns were abandoned on the hillside. The first assault was broken. Junot sent in the grenadiers, the reserve grenadiers of the 1st and 2nd Battalions, the elite of the French force, came up the same slope with the same confidence, and met something they had not encountered before. General Henry Shrapnel had invented a new kind of artillery round, a shell packed with musket balls and a timed fuse, designed to burst above advancing infantry and scatter lethal fragments across a wide area. At Vimeiro, this ammunition was used in significant quantities for the first time in a major engagement. The grenadier columns, presenting a dense target as they climbed, were caught by shrapnel bursting overhead and conventional volleys from the ridge. They reached halfway up the hill. They could get no further. They left their dead on the slope and withdrew. The third French assault went at Vimeiro village. General Kellerman, son of the hero of Valmy, already building his own reputation, led the remaining reserve grenadiers by a lower route, avoiding the killing slopes, pushing into the village streets. What he found there was the 43rd Light Infantry, barricaded into the churchyard, firing from behind stone walls at men trying to force their way through narrow lanes. The fighting in Vimeiro village was close and savage. There are accounts of British and French soldiers running each other through simultaneously, dying locked together. Kellerman's men took the outer streets and lost them again when General Acland's brigade came down from the Ventosa Ridge and hit the French flank. The third assault was broken. The fourth came from the north. Junot's flanking columns, Generals Brenier and Solignac, had been marching since before the main battle began, trying to reach the British left. The terrain had split them. Solignac hit the Ventosa Ridge first, climbing towards what he expected to be a lightly held position. What he found was Ferguson's and Nightingale's brigades, which Wellesley had quietly shifted from the western ridge the moment he spotted the flanking movement. The 71st Highland Light Infantry and the 82nd Regiment rose from the reverse slope, delivered their volley, and went forward with the bayonet. Solignac himself was wounded. His brigades fled, abandoning guns on the hillside. When Brenier's column arrived minutes later and briefly recaptured some of the abandoned artillery, the 71st and the 82nd simply turned, formed line again, and broke them a second time. General Brenier was taken prisoner. 4 assaults, 4 repulses, 14 French guns captured, 2,000 French casualties against 700 British and Portuguese. The battle was over by midday. The French army was retreating in disorder toward Torres Vedras. The road to Lisbon opened behind them, their cohesion broken, their commanders wounded or captured. Wellesley rode his lines, and what he saw told him everything he needed to know. 4 fresh brigades had not fired a shot. The French cavalry that Junot had held in reserve had not been used and could not stop a pursuit. The road south was open. He asked for permission to advance. General Sir Harry Burrard said no. Burrard had arrived the previous evening by frigate and, being senior to Wellesley, had taken nominal command. He had watched the battle from a safe distance. Now, with the French broken and 4,000 fresh troops waiting, he decided the army should wait for further reinforcements before advancing. Wellesley argued. Burrard declined to be moved. The moment passed. Junot reached Torres Vedras and began to reorganise. The following morning brought General Sir Hugh Dalrymple, senior to Burrard, who took command in turn and proved even less inclined to act. Within 48 hours of the most complete British tactical victory in the Peninsular War, 3 different generals had held command of the army, and none of them had done anything with it. What followed was, in its way, as remarkable as the battle itself. Junot, trapped and desperate, sent Kellerman to negotiate. Kellerman arrived at the British headquarters with proposals. Dalrymple and Burrard, apparently relieved to be offered an exit, agreed to terms that made the British public gasp when they found out. The Convention of Sintra, signed on August 30th, provided that the entire French army, 20,000 men, would be transported to France on British ships with all their weapons, equipment, and personal property. The personal property of French soldiers in an occupied country covered a great deal of what they had stolen. Junot's army sailed home. The reaction in Britain was volcanic. The Times called it a disgrace. Lord Byron wrote verse about it. William Wordsworth wrote a pamphlet. Parliament demanded an inquiry. All 3 generals were recalled to London to explain themselves before a board of inquiry that sat through November and December 1808. Wellesley emerged from the inquiry with his reputation substantially intact. He had argued against the convention, been overruled, and could demonstrate that point with documentation. Parliament passed a formal vote of thanks to him specifically for the battle, while Dalrymple and Burrard were quietly removed from command. Neither saw active service again. Wellesley was back in Portugal within months, this time as Commander-in-Chief. He did not forget Vimeiro. The reverse slope tactic that had broken 4 French assaults on those hillsides became the structural foundation of how he fought every subsequent engagement in the peninsula. At Talavera, at Salamanca, at Waterloo itself, the same principle applied. Find the ground, hide the army behind the crest, let the French artillery fire at empty hillsides, and then stand up and volley when the assault crested the ridge. French generals spent 7 years trying to find an answer to it. They never quite did. The Battle of Vimeiro mattered for a reason that went beyond its tactical lessons. It was the first demonstration on European soil that French infantry attacking in column could be stopped and broken by British infantry defending in line. Every French victory before 1808 had rested in part on the psychological impact of the assault column. The mass, the drums, the momentum, the sense that what was coming was irresistible. Vimeiro showed that it was not irresistible. It could be stopped by men who knew the ground, kept their nerve, and waited. That knowledge spread through the peninsula and eventually through Europe. When other armies learned to stand behind ridges and let the French come to them, the Napoleonic tactical system began to unravel. It started on a hillside above a small Portuguese village, on a summer morning when 4 French assaults broke against an army that no one could quite see. That is what happened at Vimeiro,